I use a lot of shrink tubing for my sea trout patterns, specifically the ones that need basically a trailing hook, such as your secret weapons, tandems, even your surface lures. So I'm just going to show you quickly how I prepare the mounts. The reason why I use shrink tubing for the mount is that it actually gives a stronger mount. It also gives, because basically the strength of the braid that's in the middle is it's a stronger mount than what you could essentially get away with from a nylon perspective because of the diameter. It's also a flexible mount, but not too flexible. So when the shrink tubing is shrunk, it is still flexible, but actually rigid enough that it doesn't double back to catch the front hook. And also then one of the main reasons I utilize shrink tubing is because it allows me to create the mounts very, very quickly compared to twisting, nylon, wire, all of this kind of stuff. These mounts get created very, very quickly. So I'm going to show you now how to create a very quick mount, which you can basically then mess around with. You can apply it to singles, doubles, trebles, whatever you choose to use. I'm just going to use single hooks on the front end. The trailing hooks I like to use are the Partridge Nordic tube singles. I like to use them in either an 8 or a 6, just depending on the length of the fly. So the first thing you need to do is cut a length of the shrink tubing. Now the length you cut basically is dictated by the overall size of the fly you're going to be creating. So this will really vary accordingly. So I've just got to cut a section there, probably about 1.5 to 3 centimeters or so. And what we then do in the core, so the core is braid. So whatever braid you choose to use, I'm actually just going to do this with 20 kilos, so about 40 something pound Power Pro braid. Again, it doesn't really matter which brand, or strength to a certain extent, but one of the main reasons for using braid, obviously, it's thin and strong. This is 0.28 millimeters, which is probably the equivalent of around 10-pound nylon or so. Cut a length of around 20 centimeters, 8 inches, something around there. Then that's all you do is you get your hook. So that's actually a size 8 Nordic tube single. You really want a straight eye. The reason for the straight eye is that when you shrink it inside the braid, inside the shrink tubing, it then doesn't kick the shrink tubing off at an angle. So you really want, for your protruding hook, the trailing hook, really you want that to be a straight eye. That's all you then do is you pass through the braid through the eye of the hook, like so. Marry up the tag ends, so the 2 tag ends, just marry them up. When you get into this process, it's really, really simple. That's all you then do is take the shrink tubing over, and the diameters for shrink tubing, they come in various diameters and various colors as well. I tend to use black or clear, but you can mess around accordingly. The main diameter, or the most useful diameter, is probably the one I'm using now, which is 3. I think most of the time they actually call it a 3.2 millimeters, but anything around 3 millimeters. You can sometimes get away, I think there's a 2.4 millimeters. Anyway, something around there is absolutely perfect. Again, this is probably around 3 millimeters. Really, the diameter is dictated by the size of the eye of the hook. So if it just passes over, you really want it snug. This is actually quite loose fitting, but because of the shrink ratio, that will be fine. But the 2.4, you probably get away with a 2.4 millimeter here too. So that's all it is. So essentially, the shrink tubing, you want it just over the eye, and then a couple of millimeters down the hook shank as well. That will stop it from sliding off, but that will also keep that in a straight line. So the next step is to shrink the shrink tubing. You can do this in a couple of ways. I've heard of people using kettles and stuff to shrink it. I've never tried that, to be honest. I've always used a lighter to do it. But most recently, over the last couple of years, I invested in, you can see the nozzle, pardon me, nozzle just pointing out here in the side of the shot. That's actually for a temperature controlled heat gun. Now if you're going to do a lot of these, and I also make my own welded loops on the end of my sink tips, fly lines, and all sorts. So actually for mending the lines as well. So I invested in a heat or temperature controlled heat gun. They're only, well, saying only, they're 20 to 30 pounds or so nowadays, but if you're going to get the use out of it, which I do, then it's certainly justified. And I usually do a load of these in batches, so then you can just get on to making the final patterns a lot quicker. So that's all you then do. So I'm just going to turn on this, turn on the heat gun, bear with me. Temperature wise, you don't need to go that hot, so I found the best heat to be around 160. The problem is with use the lighters is that lighters can actually melt the braid in the core, which invariably then weakens the overall mount, which can lead to a lost fish. So be careful if you do use lighters. A temperature controlled heat gun again will give you much more control over the temperature, and again I found around 160, so basically enough heat to shrink the tubing, and that's it. You don't need anything more than that. Just find the temperature that does that basically. That's all I'm going to do now. I'm going to introduce the shrink tubing to the heat, and that will just begin to just pass it up and down the heat source, and that's it, shrinking it. Just shrinking it slowly as you move along. And what you want to do is you want to keep it all very taut, okay? So you hold the hook in one hand, the braid in the other, and as you're doing this, just hold it all, just pull a bit, keep tension between the two, okay? And that's fully shrunk now. So all we're going to do now is just hold the two ends just for a few seconds, just until that heat shrink cools down, because what's going to happen then is that's just going to remain in a perfectly straight line, which is obviously what you want. So just hold that in a straight line, and that's it. Just going to turn this off. So what you'll end up with is a really nice and straight trailing hook. So that is then ready to attach to the hook, and as you can see, it's still fairly rigid, but still flexible enough that it's going to move with the fish, so you're going to keep that hook hold. I always found these to be incredibly good hookers, to be honest, incredibly good. So yeah, just the best of both worlds really, or all worlds. And you can see how quickly that was created. So that's on to the next step now, where we actually attach that to the front hook, which I'll show you next. Now that the shrink tube mount is created, or the protruding part of the mount is created, we're now going to attach it to the front hook. Again, for the trailing hook, I was using the Partridge Nordic tube single in either an 8 or a 6, and again that just depends on the length of the mount, or the size of the fly essentially. If it's a bigger fly, then go for the 6. If it's a smaller fly, then go for the 8. And then for the front hook, I'm going to use the Partridge Attitude Extra Salt. Use these in the 4, works really well with a size 6. I think they also do a size 6 in this. If you're using a size 6, then use the size 8 as the protruding hook. Just basically drop one size for the trailing hook. I prefer a slightly smaller trailing hook as opposed to the front hook, which is always the bigger hook. Essentially, that's going to give you more weight in the front end rather than the fly becoming back heavy. So that's all we're going to do. So I've got the size 4 in the vise here. We're going to start off by making a little bed of thread, just like so. Then we're going to bring this mount up. So again, the size of the mount really depends on the fly you're tying. So you can tie these, a much longer. You can even tie them shorter. To an extent, if you're tying them very short, there's not much of a need really for the trailing hook. This is basically to, if the fish are coming short or whatever, to catch those tail nippers. So if you are tying a very short pattern, then essentially this becomes obsolete. The typical overall length, I would say, of the mount itself is probably around 2 inches, 5 centimeters, something similar to that. So I'm just going to measure that up. And what we're going to do then is, you always keep a little bit of the shrink tubing on the front mount itself. Otherwise, there's too much play on the protruding mount. So we actually catch a length of that shrink tubing into the front hook and the mount, just to tie in a few turns. And then, before we really secure it, we can adjust the mount so that it's sitting directly on top of the front hook and also running in a straight line down the hook. Okay, so that's that. And then we take the 2 tag ends of the braid down towards the eye. At this point, you can see there's no thread in behind the eye here, and these 2 tag ends are are very thin. So we pass both ends in through the eye and just pass them back and underneath. Pull them tight and then just work back down the shank of the front hook. So what we've done there is, again, we've just taken it through, doubled it, and then just take it down a little bit, and then they can be cut. Those 2 ends can be cut. And now just take some tight turns over the shrink tubing just to really bed it in well, just like so. And that's it. So that's your mount. So I usually do to this point in batches, because then what we do is we just tie that off. Okay, so at that point, chances are that's not going to, like, that back hook will not pull through. And remember, the strength of this mount is now 20 kilos. Okay, so we're talking about 40 something pounds. It's a really, really strong mount. So the only weak point would essentially be where this has passed through the front hook. But because we've created a layer of thread to begin with, then doubled it back through doubled the braid back through the eye, it's really going nowhere. But just for security purposes, what we now do is we just put a bit of super glue on, just like so. Because what that will do, because the braid will absorb the super glue, that will absorb into the super glue and also into the thread at the same time. So basically it will create a really solid bond between the braid and the thread, and honestly at that point it's indestructible. You're gonna snap your line, or this is going to be up the tree before this mount breaks. But again, the beauty of this is that flexibility. You can see how quickly, I've been talking through how to create it, but you can see how quickly this was created. You've got that flexibility, so it's rigid enough that it's not going to come back and catch on your line, but then it's got enough flexibility. If a fish does take this, it hasn't got that rigidity there that it's actually going to lever the hook hold. It's actually going to move with the fish. That's the a real key element of it, along with how quickly it is to dress. It's a really streamlined effect, and at this point, basically, the fly tying world's your oyster. You can put whatever materials on. That's the mount for example, creating a surface lure. It's the same mount for creating a tandem, secret weapon, or whatever. But you can see how quickly it is to create. You can adjust the size of the front hook, rear hook. You can adjust the color of the shrink tubing in the middle. There's a lot of different things you can explore according to your end result and what you're trying to create. Anyway, I hope you found that of use, and I hope it brings you luck in the future.